The first time I noticed it, I confess I laughed into my teacup and nearly disgraced myself before the whole of Moorhaven's morning room. Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, a young widow of no great fortune but considerable composure, had been asked by Lady Prudence Ashworth-Vane to read a chapter of Mr. Richardson's novel aloud at 3:30 precisely. And at 3:30 precisely, as though summoned by the turning of a page, the Duke of Moorhaven's boots sounded in the hall. I am Sir Hugh Calloway, and I have known the Ashworth-Vane family since before the present Duke could walk unassisted. So you may trust me when I tell you that Lady Prudence had never in 40 years cared what o'clock it was for anything save her tea. She was 71 years old, half blind by her own frequent claim and entirely too sharp-eyed by her actual behavior, and she had decided, with the singular ferocity of a woman who has given up on her own marriage prospects decades ago, that her nephew required a wife before he turned entirely to stone. I was seated near the window that afternoon, ostensibly there to discuss a boundary dispute over a stretch of hedgerow with the Duke. But in truth I had come because Lady Prudence's schemes were, at that point in my life, the finest entertainment available in the county. I watched Mrs. Thorne's hand still upon the page. I watched her lift her eyes, not toward the door, where the Duke's tread announced him, but toward Lady Prudence, whose expression was that of a general reviewing a battlefield she had already won. "Shall I begin again, my lady?" said Mrs. Thorne, in a voice that betrayed nothing but the faintest, driest note of amusement. "Or would you prefer I wait until his grace has settled?" "Nonsense," said Lady Prudence. "Read on. Julian does not mind being read at, do you, Julian?" The Duke of Moorhaven, Julian Ashworth-Vane, whom half the ton had taken to calling the Juniper Duke on account of the ancient juniper hedge that bordered Moorhaven's famous gardens, and whom the other half called simply Severe, paused in the doorway with his hat still in his hand. He was a tall man, dark-haired, with a jaw that seemed built expressly for disapproval and eyes that missed very little, though on that particular afternoon they seemed to be missing everything that mattered. "I do not mind it in the least," he said, and took the chair his aunt indicated, which happened to be angled precisely so that he faced Mrs. Thorne across the low table, with the light from the tall windows falling generously upon her. I watched him listen. I watched, too, the small, private furrow that appeared between Mrs. Thorne's brows, not distress, but calculation. She was doing sums in her head, I understood later, adding up coincidences the way a shopkeeper adds a column of figures, and not liking the total. She had come to Moorhaven only a fortnight before, engaged as a companion to read to Lady Prudence 3 afternoons a week, her modest widow's income from her late husband's small estate in Hampshire being insufficient to keep her in coal, and candles without some occupation to supplement it. She had been a clergyman's daughter before her marriage, and she read Latin as easily as English, which had impressed Lady Prudence enormously and secured the position on the spot. She was perhaps 24, with a composed, watchful face that made her look older in judgment and younger in hope, and she wore her mourning grays with the unfussy dignity of a woman who had buried a husband she had respected more than adored, and who intended to go on living regardless. I liked her at once. I liked, too, watching the Duke discover that he liked her, though it took him considerably longer than it ought to have, for he was a man who distrusted his own inclinations on principle, having been disappointed by them once before in his youth. In a manner I will not trouble you with here save to say it had left him wary of women who arrived at Moorhaven with any appearance of design. Mrs. Thorne, to her very great credit, had no design whatsoever. That was, I think, precisely why the scheme worked as well as it did. That first Tuesday, the reading ended promptly at 4, and the Duke stayed only to discuss the hedgerow with me and depart, apparently unaware that anything at all irregular had occurred. Lady Prudence poured her tea with the satisfied air of a woman who has planted a seed and means to water it thoroughly. By the second week, the seed had become something closer to a hothouse forcing. I called at Moorhaven on the Thursday of that second week, ostensibly to return a book I had borrowed, and found the household in a state of quiet chaos. Lady Prudence had declared at 2 o'clock that she could not possibly wait for their usual 4 o'clock reading, that her eyes pained her dreadfully in the afternoon light, and she required Mrs. Thorne's company at once before the light failed entirely, though it was the height of summer and would not fail for 6 hours yet. Mrs. Thorne, summoned from the garden where she had been walking, arrived somewhat breathless and considerably bemused, book in hand, only to find that the reading was to take place not in the morning room as usual, but in the smaller drawing room that overlooked the drive. The very room, as it happened, through which the Duke customarily passed on his way in from riding. "Your eyes, my lady," Mrs. Thorne said, settling herself with the particular care of a woman choosing her words as delicately as she might choose her seat, "were remarkably well this morning when you read 3 letters unassisted at breakfast." "That was this morning," said Lady Prudence, with the serene disregard for consistency that only the very old or the very determined can achieve. "Read the letter from Cousin Ottiline, the one about the regatta." Mrs. Thorne read the letter about the regatta. She read it slowly, I noticed, with frequent pauses, as though testing whether the pauses themselves might draw some reaction from her employer. And indeed, each time she paused, Lady Prudence's gaze would drift toward the window, toward the drive, toward the exact spot where a rider on a tall bay gelding presently appeared. "Ah," said Lady Prudence with theatrical surprise. "Here is Julian now, how fortunate. He does so enjoy Ottiline's letters." I have known men to lie less convincingly on the witness stand. The Duke came in dusty from riding, saw the tableau, his aunt enthroned upon the good settee, Mrs. Thorne seated opposite with a letter in her hand, and an expression of scarcely suppressed comprehension on her face, and something in his own face shifted, very briefly, before settling back into its habitual composure. "Reading Ottiline's letters again, aunt? I thought we had agreed once was sufficient penance for any household." "Mrs. Thorne reads them so much more tolerably than I do," said Lady Prudence. "Sit down, Julian, you are letting in a draught." He sat, of course he sat. He always sat in those early weeks, with the patient, faintly puzzled air of a man who could not quite account for why his aunt's schedule had grown so erratic, nor why it seemed to align itself, with almost mathematical precision, to his own comings and goings. He was, I must stress, not a stupid man. He managed an estate of 11,000 acres with a shrewdness that had doubled its income in the 6 years since he inherited the title from his father. He sat on 2 parliamentary committees and had once, memorably, out-argued a bishop on a matter of tithes. But there is a particular blindness that afflicts intelligent men precisely where their own hearts are concerned, and the Duke suffered from it as thoroughly as any green boy fresh from Oxford. Mrs. Thorne, for her part, read on, her voice even and pleasant, betraying nothing, though I caught her eye once over the top of the letter, and saw in it something that might have been rueful amusement, or might have been the beginning of alarm at finding herself cast, without her consent, into the center of a small domestic conspiracy. I called again the following week, the 3rd week, the one in which everything came, as it were, to its reckoning. And I want to tell you plainly what I observed, because I think it does both the Duke and Mrs. Thorne great credit, and because I was, by pure chance of friendship and proximity, very nearly the only witness to the whole affair as it unfolded. By then Lady Prudence's contrivances had grown so brazen that even the housemaids had begun to exchange glances behind their trays. The reading hour had been moved twice more, once to an hour before its custom, once to an hour after, and on each occasion the Duke had arrived precisely when the reading was in progress, whether he had been expected at Moorhaven that day at all or not. On the Monday, Lady Prudence had sent a footman 2 miles to fetch her nephew from a neighboring farm on the pretext that she required his opinion on a matter of household accounts, only to have Mrs. Thorne reading to her, quite unnecessarily, the very moment he arrived. On the Wednesday came the matter of the eyesight. "My eyes," Lady Prudence announced at breakfast, with the solemnity of a woman delivering news of a grave diagnosis, "have failed me entirely for correspondence. I cannot make out so much as my own name upon an envelope. Mrs. Thorne, you must sit with me this afternoon and manage my letters, for I cannot conduct my affairs half blind." Mrs. Thorne, who had watched Lady Prudence embroider a remarkably fine handkerchief not 2 hours before by the same light she now claimed defeated her entirely, said only, "Of course, my lady," in a voice of such perfect gravity that I nearly choked on my kipper. I was present again that afternoon. I had become, by then, a regular fixture at Moorhaven, partly from genuine affection for the family and partly, I will admit, because I would not have missed the unfolding drama for a hunting season's worth of good sport. Mrs. Thorne sat at the small writing desk in the drawing-room with Lady Prudence's correspondence spread before her, her pen poised, reading aloud each letter before drafting a reply at her ladyship's dictation which grew steadily more distracted, more full of pauses, more attentive to the sound of hooves on gravel than to the actual content of any letter. At 3:30, the Duke arrived. He came in without his hat, having left it with the footman in the hall, and stopped in the doorway of the drawing-room with an expression I had not seen on his face before, not the mild puzzlement of the previous fortnight, but something clearer, something that had, I think, been building in him quietly for 3 weeks, and had only that afternoon arrived at its full and inescapable shape. "Aunt Prudence," he said, "your eyes are quite failed," said Lady Prudence, without looking up from the letter she was not reading. "You embroidered a rose on my handkerchief on Tuesday, so fine I could not find the stitches with a glass. A momentary improvement. They come and go." "They have come and gone 11 times in 3 weeks," said the Duke. "And on each occasion, without exception, Mrs. Thorne has been reading to you at precisely the hour I was known, or expected, or specifically summoned to arrive." There was a silence in the room of the sort that has weight and texture, the sort you could have cut and served on a plate. Mrs. Thorne set down her pen with great care, as though it might otherwise clatter and betray her nerves, and looked at neither of them, but out the window, at the juniper hedge beyond the glass, with the fixed attention of a woman determined not to laugh and not entirely succeeding. "I am sure I do not know what you mean," said Lady Prudence, with the magnificent unrepentance of the truly guilty. "I mean," said the Duke, crossing the room and standing now before the small writing desk, "that my aunt has spent 3 weeks engineering my company with a widow of her acquaintance with all the subtlety of a siege engine, and that I have only this moment fully grasped it, which I confess does not speak well of my powers of observation, since Sir Hugh appears to have understood the whole business a fortnight ago, and has been enjoying himself immensely at my expense." "Enormously," I said from my chair by the fire, and made no effort whatsoever to disguise it. Lady Prudence set down the letter she had been holding, and regarded her nephew with the particular dignity of a general who, having lost the field, intends to lose it gracefully. "I am an old woman," she said, "with very little amusement left to me, Julian, and I will not apologize for wishing to see you settled before I am in my grave and past caring. You have gone 6 years since your father died managing this estate like a man twice your age and courting no one at all, and I grew weary of waiting for you to notice what was directly in front of you." "And what," said the Duke, "do you imagine was directly in front of me?" Lady Prudence did not answer. She merely looked with unmistakable and entirely unsubtle meaning at Mrs. Thorne. The widow, thus indicated, set down her pen entirely and folded her hands upon the desk with the composure of a woman who has decided that if she is to be exposed as the object of a scheme, she will at least be exposed with her dignity fully intact. "I should say, Your Grace," she said, "that I have had no part in your aunt's design beyond reading exactly what she asked me to read, at exactly the hour she instructed. If I have been made an instrument of matchmaking, I assure you I did not sharpen myself for the purpose." "I never supposed you had," said the Duke, and there was something in his voice, a warmth, a directness, that had not been there in any of our previous conversations about hedgerows or tithes or tenant leases. "I have watched you these 3 weeks, Mrs. Thorne, read my aunt's correspondence and her novels, and on one memorable occasion, an entire chapter of a sermon she did not in the least require, all with a composure that I confess I found first curious, then admirable, and now—" He stopped himself, as a man does when he has arrived nearer the edge of a confession than he intended to stand. "Now," said Mrs. Thorne, and there was, I thought, the very faintest tremor beneath the evenness of her voice, not fear, but something nearer hope, guarded as carefully as a candle carried through a draught. "Now I find I do not much mind having been managed," said the Duke, "provided I am permitted to manage the rest of the business myself." He turned to his aunt, whose satisfaction was by then so complete and so entirely unhidden that she resembled nothing so much as a cat that has not merely caught the cream, but arranged for it to be delivered on a silver tray. "You will please stop pretending at blindness, aunt. It does not become you, and it is not fooling anyone, least of all the housemaids, who I am given to understand have taken wagers on the outcome of your campaign." 2 to 1 in your favor, Your Grace," I supplied helpfully, "as of Tuesday last." "Thank you, Hugh, that is precisely the sort of intelligence I did not require." He turned back to Mrs. Thorne, and here his manner changed once more, the wry exasperation falling away, replaced by something graver, more careful, the look of a man laying down an argument he has rehearsed and finding it harder to deliver aloud than it had been in the privacy of his own thoughts. Mrs. Thorne, I will not insult you by pretending that my aunt's scheme was unwelcome to me, when the plain truth is that I have found myself arranging my own days around the hope of finding you in this room, quite without her assistance, for a week at least before I understood what I was doing. I should like to call on you properly. Not by the contrivance of a failed eye or an urgent letter or a chapter read at a convenient hour, but honestly, and in full view of anyone who cares to observe it, which, given my aunt's talents, will apparently be the entire household and half the county besides. Will you permit it? I have attended a great many proposals of one kind and another in my life, some of them my own, most of them considerably less interesting than this, and I can tell you that the silence which followed the Duke's small speech was the longest and most consequential silence I have ever sat through in a Moorhaven drawing-room, and I have sat through some very long ones indeed, including the reading of his late father's will. Mrs. Thorne rose from the writing desk. She did not rush to answer, and I thought the better of her for it, for a woman who agrees too quickly to anything is a woman who has not properly weighed it, and she was not a woman given to careless weighing. Your Grace, she said, I am a widow of very modest means, engaged in your household as a companion to your aunt, and I have no illusions about what such a position means for a woman in my circumstances, nor what the world will make of it if a duke begins to call upon her properly, as you say. I will not pretend that does not frighten me a little. But I have found these 3 weeks, scheme, and all, the best company I have kept since my husband died, and I think I have known for at least a week myself what you have only just discovered, though I flatter myself I concealed it rather better than you did. Considerably better, said Lady Prudence with enormous satisfaction. I had begun to think I should have to write you a script, Julian. Aunt Prudence, said the Duke, without taking his eyes from Mrs. Thorne, I believe you have done quite enough directing for one lifetime. Nonsense, said Lady Prudence. I have only just begun. And that, dear reader, for I set this down some months later, once the whole business had run its course and I could tell it properly, with the ending known and the outcome settled, was the moment the scheme ceased to be a scheme at all, and became, instead, a courtship conducted in the open, before witnesses, with all the particular joy of a thing no longer hidden. I should tell you what followed because it was not, as you might suppose, a swift business concluded in a fortnight. The Duke was not a man given to hasty decisions in matters that mattered to him, and Mrs. Thorne was not a woman who would be swept along by any man's declaration, however handsome the man or however charmingly delivered the speech. She required, in her own words to me some weeks later, over a dish of tea in my own modest parlor, where she had come to seek my counsel as her husband's oldest surviving connection in the county, to know that his Grace's regard was built on something sturdier than 3 weeks of engineered proximity and his aunt's very great cunning. You may trust my judgment on this at least, I told her. I have known Julian Ashworth Vane since he was a boy of 8 who once cried for an hour because a groom would not let him ride a horse too large for him, and I have watched him grow into a man who does nothing by half measures, least of all his affections, once he permits himself to feel them at all. He does not speak easily of his heart. I think you must have noticed that. I had, she said, noticed a certain reserve, a brooding quality, if I may say so without disrespect. He does not give his good opinion cheaply. No, I agreed. He does not. His father was a hard man in his way, not cruel but exacting, and Julian learned early that a duke's feelings are generally inconvenient to everyone around him and best kept private. It took him some years to learn otherwise, and I think, Mrs. Thorne, that you are rather further along in teaching him than you credit yourself. She colored a little at that, in a manner I found entirely becoming, and said nothing more on the subject, though I noticed she took considerably longer walks in the Moorhaven gardens over the following fortnight than her duties as a reading companion strictly required, and that the Duke's business about the estate seemed, by some curious coincidence of its own, to bring him through those same gardens with remarkable regularity. I will not pretend the courtship that followed was without its difficulties, for I should be doing both parties a disservice to suggest that love arrived and settled itself without a single obstacle, and a story told too smoothly is rarely one worth the telling. The first difficulty was, predictably, the county itself. News of a duke's marked attentions to his aunt's reading companion, a widow of no fortune, no connections beyond a country clergyman's modest name, and no claim whatsoever upon society's notice save her own evident good sense, spread through the neighborhood with the particular speed such news always achieves, faster than any letter, faster than any post-horse, carried on the tongues of housemaids and grooms, and the sort of morning callers who exist chiefly to carry gossip from one drawing-room to the next. By the end of that same month, Mrs. Thorne could not walk into the village shop without feeling the weight of a dozen curious eyes, nor attend church without catching, in the rustle of silk and the murmur behind fans, the unmistakable sound of speculation turning, in some quarters, to something less kind. "They say," Lady Prudence reported to her nephew one evening, with the particular relish of a woman who enjoyed nothing so much as repeating gossip in order to be righteously outraged by it, "that Lady Featherstonehaugh has called her a fortune huntress." To her own daughter's face, no less, at the Hendersons' card party, quite as though the woman were not standing not 10 feet distant. The Duke's expression, upon hearing this, went very still and very cold in a manner I had seen perhaps twice before in our long acquaintance. Once when a tenant farmer had cheated an elderly widow out of her cottage, and once when a fellow member of his club had made an unwise remark about the old Duke's final illness. It was not a comfortable stillness to witness, and I did not envy Lady Featherstonehaugh the interview that presently occurred, for the Duke called upon her the very next morning and left her, by all reports, considerably chastened and considerably quieter on the subject of Mrs. Thorne's character thereafter. But it was Mrs. Thorne herself who taught me the truest measure of her quality in that difficult season, for she did not hide from the gossip, nor did she cower before it, nor did she permit it to alter one particle of her natural dignity. She continued to walk into the village with her head level and her manner unchanged. She continued her duties to Lady Prudence with the same unhurried grace she had always brought to them. And when, at a dinner party some weeks later, a particularly bold matron inquired, with poorly concealed malice, whether Mrs. Thorne did not find it remarkably convenient that a duke's fortune should have taken such sudden interest in a widow of her circumstances, Mrs. Thorne answered with a composure that silenced the table entirely. "I find, madam," she said, "that I have taken no interest whatsoever in his Grace's fortune, having managed quite contentedly on considerably less than it for the whole of my widowhood, and that if his Grace's regard for me depended upon my having none, I should think rather less of his Grace than I presently do, which is, I assure you, a very great deal." I have rarely seen a room so thoroughly and so quietly put in its place, nor the Duke, seated across the table, look so entirely, helplessly delighted. It was not only Mrs. Thorne's own composure that turned the tide of county opinion, though I credit it chiefly, but also the slow, steady accumulation of small evidences that she had entered the connection for reasons that had nothing to do with calculation. She continued, throughout that difficult season, to send half her modest reading wages to a sister in Hampshire whose husband had fallen on hard times, a fact she never once mentioned herself, and which I learned only by accident, through the sister's own grateful letter to Lady Prudence thanking her for recommending so generous an employer. She refused, moreover, when the Duke pressed a sum upon her for a new gown suitable to the increasing number of dinners to which she found herself invited as his declared companion, accepting only after he framed it, with some cleverness, as a debt owed to his aunt's household rather than a gift from himself. Small things, none of them dramatic, but the sort of small things that, added together over a season, persuade a skeptical county far more thoroughly than any grand gesture could. And by the time the harvest suppers came round that September, even the sharpest tongues among the local gentry had largely abandoned the sport of doubting her, having found, on close examination, simply nothing to feed upon. The second difficulty, and the graver one, arrived from within the Duke's own history, and it is here that I must speak with some delicacy, for it touches upon a sorrow that was not mine to share carelessly even now. Some 8 years before the events I have described, when the Duke was not yet Duke but merely Lord Julian, heir to a title he did not yet hold, he had formed an attachment to a young woman of good family who had in the end chosen a wealthier suitor over him. Not from any failure of affection on her part, I believe, but from the plain calculations of a family in want of money, calculations she had not the independence to resist. The Duke had never spoken of it to me directly in all the years since, but I had watched its mark upon him nonetheless. A certain wariness in his dealings with women of marriageable age, a suspicion that any warmth directed toward him carried some hidden ledger of advantage being calculated behind it, a brooding reluctance to trust his own heart that had, I think, kept him unmarried a full 6 years past, when most men of his rank and fortune would have settled the matter. It was this old wound, and not any lack of feeling for Mrs. Thorne, that caused the single serious quarrel of their courtship, which occurred on an afternoon in the Moorhaven Rose Garden that I did not witness myself, but heard recounted, with considerable feeling, from both parties separately in the days that followed. The Duke, it seems, had made some remark, clumsy, unintentional, born of that old wariness rather than any true doubt of her, suggesting that Mrs. Thorne's situation was much improved by his attentions, and that he understood as much, and did not hold it against her. Mrs. Thorne, who had faced down Lady Featherstonehaugh and the whole murmuring county without flinching, did not take kindly to being told, even gently, even by the man she had come to love, that her regard for him might be weighed and found to contain some measure of calculation. "I did not marry my first husband for advantage," she told him, with a coldness I am told was considerably more alarming than any raised voice could have been, though heaven knows advantage was in short supply in that marriage and might have tempted a less scrupulous woman to look elsewhere. "I do not know what I have done, your grace, to earn your suspicion that I would love differently now." "I did not mean," the Duke began. "I know what you meant," said Mrs. Thorne. "You meant to be honest, and you were, and the honesty does you some credit, but I will not spend the whole of a marriage being quietly weighed against a ledger only you can see, wondering each time I express a fondness for you whether you are totting up sums in your head. I have buried one husband, your grace, and grown accustomed to managing for myself since. I do not require your fortune to be happy. I should like very much to have concluded that you understood that by now." She left him standing among his own roses, by his own account to me later, feeling his words, not mine, like the greatest fool ever to hold a dukedom. He came to me that evening, which was not his habit, for he was not a man given to seeking counsel on matters of the heart, having spent most of his adult life believing such matters best managed alone and in silence. But he sat in my study with a glass of brandy he did not drink and told me the whole of it, and something in his face when he finished, a rawness I had not seen since he was a very young man newly parted from his first attachment, persuaded me that this was not merely another obstacle in a courtship, but the true crossing point of it, the moment at which the old wound would either heal or fester permanently. "You have spent 8 years," I told him, "guarding yourself against exactly this, against loving a woman and wondering forever after whether her love for you was ever entirely her own or partly your title's. I understand it. I watched what that business did to you the first time, and I do not blame you for the wariness. But Hugh Calloway has known you since you were 8 years old, crying over a horse too large for you, and I will tell you now what I would not have presumed to tell you then. Eleanor Thorne is not the woman who broke your heart at 20. She has buried a husband of no fortune at all and managed her own affairs since without complaint or plea for pity, and she stood in a dining room full of your county's sharpest tongues and told them to their faces that she had taken no interest whatsoever in your money. If you cannot trust that, Julian, you cannot trust anything, and you will go to your own grave as wary and alone as your father very nearly did." He was silent a long while over that, staring into the fire, and I let him sit with it, for some truths cannot be hurried past a man's pride, however gently delivered. "I must go to her," he said at last. "You must," I agreed, "though I should wait until morning, for a man does not apologize well by moonlight after brandy, however little of it he has actually drunk." He went the next morning, and what passed between them in the Rose Garden a second time I did not witness either, save for the very end of it, for I had walked over on the pretext of returning a borrowed hedge clipper, and arrived in time to see the Duke take Mrs. Thorne's hand. Not with any impropriety, but simply, gravely, as a man takes the hand of someone he has wronged and hopes to be forgiven by, and to hear him say, in a voice that carried further than he perhaps intended across the quiet garden air, "I have spent 8 years assuming that any woman's regard for me came with a hidden accounting. Because the one time I trusted it wholly, I was wrong, and it cost me something I did not think I would recover from. I was wrong again yesterday, Eleanor, not about you, but about myself. I let an old wound speak in a moment that deserved better than my old fears. You have given me no cause whatsoever to doubt you, and every cause to trust you, and I am sorry it took a second offense against your dignity for me to see it plainly. I do not ask you to forget yesterday. I ask only that you allow me the chance to prove, over whatever years I am given, that I have learned better." Mrs. Thorne did not answer at once. She was not, as I have said, a woman to be hurried. But I saw her hand tighten upon his, and I saw something in her face ease that had been drawn tight since the previous afternoon, and I took that as my cue to retreat quietly with my hedge clipper and leave them to the rest of the conversation in the privacy it deserved. I am not so ungenerous a narrator as to leave you wondering how the matter resolved. It resolved, as such matters generally do when both parties are people of genuine good sense and genuine feeling, in reconciliation, and in a courtship that proceeded thereafter with considerably more openness on the Duke's part and considerably more ease on Mrs. Thorne's. For each had, in that one difficult exchange, learned something true and necessary about the other's heart that no amount of pleasant reading-hour proximity could have taught them. I ought to say something, too, of the ordinary weeks that followed the reconciliation, for it is easy, in the telling of any love story, to rush from crisis to wedding bells and neglect the quieter middle in which two people actually learn the daily shape of each other. And I think that middle deserves its own place in this account, since it was there, more than in any single dramatic scene, that I came to believe the match would truly hold. There was, for instance, an afternoon in late August when I came upon the Duke and Mrs. Thorne in the Moorhaven orchard, of all unlikely places, engaged in the thoroughly unromantic business of helping Lady Prudence's elderly gardener count the season's apple crop against his ledger. For the old man's arithmetic had never been dependable, and Lady Prudence trusted no one else to check it. The Duke stood atop a short ladder passing down baskets, his coat discarded over a fence post, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow in a manner no Duke of my acquaintance would have permitted himself before a stranger, while Mrs. Thorne stood below with the ledger balanced on her arm, calling out sums, correcting his count twice with a dry courtesy that made him laugh outright. A full, unguarded laugh I had not heard from him since he was a boy. "You have miscounted the middle row twice now, Your Grace," she told him, which I confess surprises me in a man who is said to have doubled his own rents through nothing but careful arithmetic. "Rents do not wobble on a ladder, Mrs. Thorne, nor do they generally throw apples at one's head when one is not looking, as that branch has just done. I saw no such thing. You were laughing too hard to see it. I never laugh at a duke's misfortunes. You are laughing now." She was in fact laughing, not the careful, composed amusement she permitted herself in drawing rooms, but something looser and more genuine, and I stood at the orchard gate a moment simply watching it, for I do not think I had seen her laugh so freely since her arrival at Moorhaven, and it struck me, watching them, that whatever else Lady Prudence's scheme had accomplished, it had also given each of them something neither had much possessed before: an ease, a lightness, a permission to be foolish together in an orchard on an ordinary afternoon with no audience save an old gardener and his ledger and myself, who did not count. There was another evening, nearer September, when the Duke rode over to my own house unannounced, which was rare enough in itself, and sat with me by the fire, not to unburden himself of any difficulty, but simply, as he admitted somewhat sheepishly, because he wished to speak of her to someone and could not very well speak of her to his aunt without receiving a full accounting of every triumph claimed. He spoke of small things, a book she had recommended and been right about, a remark she had made about his tenants that had reshaped, in a single sentence, an entire policy he had been debating for a year, the particular way she read aloud so that even a dull sermon gained some warmth in her voice. He spoke, in short, like a man who had stopped merely admiring a woman and begun to build a life around the specific, unremarkable daily fact of her, which is, I have always believed, the truer beginning of love than any single dramatic declaration, however finely delivered in a rose garden. Lady Prudence, for her part, declared herself vindicated entirely by the whole affair, and took to reminding anyone who would listen that she had known the match was a good one from the very first fortnight, quite as though she had not spent that fortnight manufacturing eye troubles and misremembered letters with the single-minded determination of a general planning, a campaign. "I do wonder, Aunt," the Duke said to her one evening, some 2 months into the courtship, when the worst of the county's gossip had died into the milder murmur of general approval, "what you should have done had Mrs. Thorne proved entirely indifferent to me. I should have found her a better husband elsewhere and started again with someone else for you," said Lady Prudence, without a moment's hesitation. "For I had determined you would be married within the 12-month one way or another, Julian, and I do not make declarations I am unwilling to see through." "A terrifying philosophy of life," I observed, but an effective one evidently. "The only kind worth holding," said Lady Prudence with enormous complacency, and helped herself to another cake. It was in the autumn of that year, some 5 months after the afternoon I have described at such length, the afternoon of the failed eyesight, and the letter about the regatta and the reckoning that followed it, that the Duke of Moorhaven and Mrs. Eleanor Thorne were married in the small stone church that stood at the edge of the Moorhaven estate, within sight of the ancient juniper hedge that had given the Duke his affectionate epithet among the country folk, who had watched 3 generations of his family come and go. I will tell you, because I think it does the story proper justice, that the church was full to its very doors, and not merely with the family's usual circle. Lady Featherstonehaugh attended, and had the grace to look somewhat abashed when Mrs. Thorne no longer by the ceremony's end, but her Grace the Duchess of Moorhaven, greeted her with perfect civility and not the smallest flicker of triumph, which I thought a more thorough victory than any set-down could have achieved. The village turned out in numbers I had not seen since the old Duke's funeral, drawn by equal parts affection for the family and considerable curiosity to see for themselves the widow who had, by every account circulating the county for half a year, quite thoroughly captured their notoriously guarded young Duke. She came up the aisle in a gown of soft blue-gray, not the deep mourning she had worn upon her arrival at Moorhaven a year before, nor the stark black of a widow newly bereaved, but a color that seemed to me, watching from my pew with an old friend's unashamed sentiment, to mark exactly the distance she had traveled, neither erasing what she had been nor refusing what she was becoming. She carried herself with the same composure I had watched her bring to 100 small trials that year, Lady Prudence's schemes, the county's gossip, the Duke's own hard-won honesty. And when she reached the front of the church and the Duke turned to look at her, I saw on his face an expression I had waited the better part of 6 years to see there. Not the careful reserve of a man guarding his heart, nor the brooding wariness of a man once burned and twice cautious, but something entirely open, entirely unguarded, entirely glad. "You are certain," I heard him murmur to her, so quietly that I believe only I, standing nearest as I was asked to stand witness to the register, caught the words, "that you will not tire of my aunt's meddling, for I promise you she has not finished with us. She has already begun a campaign, I am reliably informed, upon the subject of grandchildren." "Your Grace," said the new Duchess, with the dry composure that I had come, by then, to love in her nearly as much as he did, "I have survived 3 weeks of falsified eyesight and 11 separate coincidences of timing. I believe I can withstand your aunt's opinions on the subject of grandchildren." "That," said Lady Prudence from her seat in the front pew, in a voice that carried considerably further than she perhaps intended, or perhaps intended precisely as far as it carried, "is exactly the spirit I was hoping for." The church, predictably, dissolved into laughter, and the vicar, who had known the family 30 years and had officiated at both the old Duke's funeral and the christening of the present one, waited with visible good humor for the room to settle before he continued the service. I stood as witness that day, as I had stood witness to the whole quiet drama from its very first coincidental reading hour, and I will confess that I wept a little, in the manner old friends permit themselves at such occasions, not from sorrow but from the particular gladness of watching 2 people arrive, by whatever crooked and conspiratorial path, at a happiness that suited them both entirely. Lady Prudence lived a further 11 years after that wedding, long enough to see her nephew's household blessed with children whose company delighted her exceedingly, and long enough to claim credit at every family gathering thereafter, for a match she never tired of describing as her finest achievement, finer, she would say, than any garden she had ever cultivated, though the roses of Moorhaven were, by common county agreement, the envy of 3 neighboring estates. She never once expressed the smallest regret for her scheming, nor any embarrassment at having been so thoroughly discovered in it, and I believe she considered the Duke's public acknowledgment of her contrivance, that afternoon in the drawing-room, not an exposure but a kind of victory lap. As for the Duke and Duchess of Moorhaven, I can report, from the considerable vantage of a lifelong friendship maintained across the years that followed, that theirs proved a marriage built on a foundation considerably sturdier than 3 weeks of engineered proximity, however delightfully engineered, built, rather, on the plain and rare accomplishment of 2 people who had each learned, at some cost, to trust the truth of what they felt rather than the shadows their pasts had taught them to expect. The Duke never entirely lost his brooding edge, I do not think a man forged by his particular history ever entirely could, nor would I have wished it away, for it was bound up in the very steadiness and quiet honor that made him worth loving in the first place. But he softened, in the years I watched him after that autumn wedding, into a man who laughed more readily, who spoke of his own feelings without the old wariness, who watched his wife across a crowded drawing room with an open and unguarded fondness that the whole county came, in time, to consider simply a fact of Moorhaven, as permanent and unremarkable as the ancient juniper hedge itself. And the Duchess, well, she continued, for the whole of her life, to read aloud most beautifully, though she never again did so at a suspiciously convenient hour, having, as she was fond of remarking, no further need of contrivance once the truth of the matter had been so thoroughly and so publicly declared before a shocked and delighted society. She kept her quiet strength intact through every season of that long marriage, weathering the ordinary trials of a great household with the same unhurried composure she had brought to a reading chair in a Moorhaven drawing-room on the ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I first watched a duke walk, unknowing, into his aunt's very well-laid trap, and find, to his own great and lasting fortune, that he did not wish to walk back out of it again. I have told this story many times since, at dinners and by firesides, and once, memorably, to the Duke's own eldest daughter, who wished to know how her parents had met, and was delighted beyond measure to learn that her grandmother had engineered the whole business with nothing more than a false claim of failing eyesight and an unshakable determination to see her nephew happy. I tell it now as I have always told it, with great affection, with no small amusement at Lady Prudence's magnificent shamelessness, and with the particular satisfaction of a man who had the good fortune to watch, at close range, two people find their way past pride and old wounds and a meddling aunt's transparent schemes, into a love that the whole of society, once so ready to whisper and speculate, came in the end only to admire.